Copper and ozone tasted like panic. That was the first thing Rachel realized when the blast doors blew. Nobody told the human auxiliary unit. They were guarding the galaxy's most ruthless dictator. They just said to hold the line. Now the line was dead. The alien warlord was choking on his own pulverized lung. Snorts and Rachel had 3 minutes to do something incredibly stupid. She didn't want to save him. She just hated losing a patient. The diplomatic antechamber of the Sovereign Coalition was supposed to be the safest room in the quadrant. It was a cavernous hall carved from something that looked like obsidian but felt like cold glass, lined with acoustic dampeners that swallowed sound. Whole, Rachel hated it. It was too quiet. She sat on a reinforced equipment crate, her combat boots swinging inches above the polished floor. Her standard-issue fatigues felt stiff, unwashed, and entirely out of place amidst the sweeping arches and towering banners of the alien home world. She picked at a frayed thread on her knee pad. Beside her, Corporal Jenkins was asleep, his helmet tipped forward, a thin line of drool connecting his chin to the chin strap. They were just medics, auxiliary attachments, a token human presence to make the coalition look diverse and inclusive. Their actual job was to stand in the hallway, stay out of sight, and not embarrass General Hayes. Rachel was just thinking about how much she wanted a cup of cheap scalding station coffee when the ceiling tore itself apart. There was no warning klaxon, no shout over the comms, just a sudden violent shift in atmospheric pressure that popped her ears, followed by a concussive shock wave that picked her up and threw her into the far wall. The sound came a fraction of a second later, and GT, snorts, and GT, a deafening physical roar of tearing metal and shattering composite. Rachel hit the ground hard. The air was instantly choked with white dust that tasted like stale chalk and burning plastic. She gasped, inhaling the particulate, and immediately curled into a tight ball, gagging. Her vision swam. The acoustic dampeners had failed, and now the room was a chaotic echo chamber of kinetic weapons, fire, and screaming. She didn't grab her rifle. She didn't have one. She pressed her hands over her ears, squeezing her eyes shut, waiting for the ceiling to crush her. Just stay down, her brain screamed. Stay down. Stay down, stay down. A heavy, wet thud vibrated through the floorboards inches from her head. Rachel forced her eyes open. Through the swirling gray haze, she saw Jenkins. He wasn't asleep anymore. He was missing everything above the collarbone. A sharp, electric jolt of pure terror hit her stomach. It wasn't a heroic surge of adrenaline. Its snorts was the cold, sickening realization that she was about to die in a hallway 50 light years from Chicago, and she hadn't even filed her overtime paperwork. She scrambled backward, her boots slipping on the slick floor until her spine hit the rigid edge of a collapsed support pillar. She wedged herself into the crevice. Her breath came in short, jagged tears. Her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't feel her fingers. Through a gap in the debris, she watched the slaughter. The assassins didn't look like soldiers. They looked like shadows moving through oil. They dropped from the ruined ceiling, clad in sleek, light-bending armor that distorted the air around them. There were only 6 of them, but they moved with a terrifying liquid efficiency. The Emperor's Royal Guard, massive armored brutes wielding heavy plasma pikes, stepped up to meet them. It wasn't a fight. It was an execution. The assassin slipped under the wide, sweeping arcs of the pikes there, monomolecular blades flashing in the emergency lighting, the air filled with the sharp stench of seared meat and the sweet ammoniac odor of alien blood. And then Rachel saw him, the Emperor. He was a giant of a creature, easily standing 8 feet tall, draped in ceremonial armor that looked like oxidized copper. He didn't run, as his guards were methodically dismantled. He drew a massive, brutal-looking sidearm and fired. The roar of the weapon was physical, punching the air out of Rachel's lungs from 30 feet away. One of the shadowy assassins evaporated into a fine mist, but there were too many. Another assassin materialized behind the Emperor, driving a jagged, sparking blade directly into the seam of his heavy backplate. The Emperor let out a sound that vibrated in Rachel's teeth, a deep, resonant bellow of pain. He spun his massive arm, backhanding the assassin with enough force to shatter the attacker's ribs with a sickening crunch. The assassin flew across the room, slamming into the far wall and crumpling into a broken heap, but the damage was done. The remaining assassins were dead, finished off by the last dying royal guard, but the Emperor was on his knees. He swayed, his four-fingered hands clawed at his own chest. Then slowly, like a felled redwood, the supreme ruler of the galaxy's most powerful military force collapsed face first onto the marble. Silence slammed back into the room. It was absolute, save for the hiss of severed power lines and the erratic crackle of failing personal shields. Rachel sat wedged in the rubble, her knees pulled to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. They're all dead, she thought. Just wait for extraction. Do not move. But then she heard it, a wet, rhythmic wheezing. It was coming from the center of the room. The Emperor, every time he inhaled, it sounded like a boot pulling out of thick mud. It was the unmistakable universal sound of a lung filling with fluid. Rachel squeezed her eyes shut. She bit her lip until she tasted copper. Let him die, she told herself. He's a dictator. He glassed a colony on the outer rim last year. He's a monster. It's not your problem. Stay in the hole. The wheezing hitched, bubbled, and turned into a desperate, choking gasp. Rachel let out a long, shuddering breath. Damn it, she whispered. She hated losing a patient. Rachel dragged herself out from behind the pillar. The dust had settled into a thick, gritty film over everything. Her knees scraped against shattered glass and jagged chunks of ceiling tile as she crawled. She didn't stand up. Standing up was how you got shot by a stray sniper. She kept her head down, dragging her heavy medical bag by its reinforced strap. It bumped against the floor, feeling infinitely heavier than it had 10 minutes ago. The smell was overwhelming now. The sterile, odorless atmosphere of the antechamber had been replaced by the stench of scorched ozone, voided bowels, and that sharp, piercing scent of ammonia leaking from the dead guards. Rachel breathed through her mouth, trying to keep her stomach from revolting. She reached the Emperor. Up close, he was terrifying. His skin wasn't smooth. It was covered in micro scales that caught the flickering emergency lights. He was lying on his side, his massive chest heaving with awful, shuddering jerks. Thick indigo fluid was pooling beneath him, staining the pristine white floor. Rachel unclipped her medical bag, her hands still trembling. Okay, she muttered to herself, her voice sounding entirely too loud in the dead Room. Okay, buddy, let's see what we've got. Step back, Rachel froze. She slowly turned her head. 3 feet away, a royal guard was propped against a dead assassin. The guard was missing his left arm from the elbow down, and half of his face was a charred, unrecognizable ruin. But his right hand was steady, and the barrel of his kinetic pistol was pointed directly at the space between Rachel's eyes. "Do not touch the sovereign," the guard rasped. His vocal cords sounded like they were submerged in gravel. Primate. Rachel stared at the gun. Hysterical laugh bubbled up in the back of her throat. She swallowed it down. She looked from the gun to the dying guard and then back to the Emperor. "Look at him," Rachel said. Her voice wasn't authoritative, it was tired, cracked and edged with panic. "He has a sucking chest wound. He's drowning in his own fluids. You shoot me, he dies in exactly 2 minutes. You want that on your conscience?" The guard's eye, the one that wasn't melted, shut, twitched. The pistol trembled. "Put it down," Rachel said, turning her back on the gun. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, exposing her back to a loaded weapon, but the wheezing was getting shallower. She didn't have time to argue. She heard a heavy clatter as the pistol hit the floor. She didn't look back to see if the guard had passed out or just given up. She popped the latches on her kit. The familiar sterile smell of antiseptic wipes and bathroom wafted up, a tiny island of sanity in the madness. She grabbed her diagnostic scanner, a sleek handheld Omni tool designed to interface with human biology. She pressed it against the Emperor's thick neck, hoping to catch a pulse or a reading on his blood oxygen levels. The screen blinked, then yellow, then flashed violently red. A cascade of error codes scrolled across the small display. Unrecognized physiology, fatal error, recalibrate. Of course, Rachel spat, tossing the useless piece of plastic aside. It skittered across the floor. Why would the brass give us alien medical data? That would make too much sense. She was flying blind. She had to rely on basic primitive mechanics. A plumbing problem was a plumbing problem, no matter what planet you were born on. She wiped her sweating palms on her thighs and leaned over the massive alien. She had to find the hole. The Emperor was wearing a ceremonial chest plate, locked into place with heavy magnetic seals. Rachel dug her fingers into the seam where the assassin's blade had punctured the armor. The metal was burning hot to the touch, singing the tips of her tactical gloves. She hissed in pain but didn't let go. She grabbed a manual pry bar from her kit, a crude, heavy titanium wedge, usually used for prying open jammed vehicle doors. She jammed it into the gap in the armor, braced her boots against the Emperor's massive ribcage, and threw her entire body weight backward. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a loud metallic shriek, the magnetic seals gave way. The chest plate snapped off, flying back and hitting Rachel in the shin. She cursed, biting back tears, but scrambled forward again. The injury was a nightmare. The assassin's blade hadn't just punctured the lung, it had shattered something structural. The Emperor didn't have a human rib. He had a solid lattice of bone plating beneath his scales. The strike had cracked that plating, driving jagged shards of his own skeleton inward. Indigo blood was bubbling fiercely from the wound, frothing with trapped air. Tension pneumothorax. Air was escaping the lung, filling the chest cavity and crushing whatever Hearts he had in there. Okay, Rachel breathed, her hands hovering over the bubbling ruin of his chest. The texture of his flesh was entirely wrong, rubbery, unnaturally hot, vibrating with a heavy syncopated rhythm. Two hearts. They were beating out of sync. One was failing. She needed to relieve the pressure immediately or his cardiovascular system would collapse. She reached into her bag and pulled out a standard human chest tube. It was a long, thick plastic needle designed to puncture a human rib cage and let trapped air escape. She looked at the Emperor's thick bone plating. The needle would snap like a twig. Improvise, she muttered, panic making her breath short and shallow. Improvise. Rachel, she frantically scanned the debris around her, her eyes locked onto a shattered plasma rifle lying near a dead guard. Specifically, she looked at the rifle's primary coolant line, a thick reinforced tube of hardened polymer capped with a sharp metallic nozzle. She crawled over, grabbed the tube and yanked. It wouldn't budge. She drew her boot knife, a cheap, heavy blade she'd bought at a station kiosk, and sawed frantically at the thick material. It finally gave way, splashing her hands with freezing chemical smelling coolant. She wiped the tube on her pants, crawled back to the Emperor, and held the jagged end of the tube over his chest. She had no anesthetic. She had no surgical field. She was a glorified ambulance driver about to stab a monarch with a piece of garbage. She gripped the tube with both hands, aimed for the deepest gap in the shattered bone lattice, and drove it downward with all her strength. The crunch was nauseating. It sounded like a heavy boot stepping on wet tree branches. Rachel felt the resistance of the alien bone give way, the polymer tube plunging deep into the chest cavity. Immediately, a violent hiss of trapped gas and aerosolized indigo blood blew out of the open end of the tube, spraying Rachel directly in the face. She sputtered, wiping the bitter metallic fluid from her eyes with the back of her forearm. The stench was foul, but the result was instant. The Emperor's horrific choking gasp smoothed out. The pressure was equalizing, but the victory lasted less than a second. The sudden rush of oxygen back into his surviving lungs shocked his massive system. The Emperor's eyes snapped open. They weren't human eyes. They were solid predatory gold with horizontal slit pupils that dilated wildly in the dim light. Before Rachel could pull her hands away, a massive, scaly hand shot up and clamped around her left wrist. The grip was inhuman. It felt like her arm had been caught in a hydraulic press. Rachel screamed a raw, ugly sound as the bones in her forearm ground together. She dropped the remaining piece of the coolant tube. The Emperor pulled her forward. His face was inches from hers. His breath smelled like copper and rotting fruit. He was delirious with pain, his golden eyes unfocused, but his survival instinct was absolute. To him, Rachel was just another attacker. Stop, Rachel yelled, her voice breaking. She pushed her free hand against his massive shoulder, trying to break his leverage. It was like pushing against a boulder. I'm fixing you, you idiot. Let go. He didn't understand. The grip tightened. Rachel felt a hairline fracture crack near her ulna. Tears of pure agony spiked in her eyes. She stopped struggling. It wasn't working. Snort. She looked directly into those terrifying alien eyes. She didn't speak with a medic's calm reassurance. Snort. She spoke with the raw, cynical fury of someone who was exhausted. terrified and fundamentally done with. This day. Look at me, she hissed through gritted teeth, her face pale. I am holding your life in my bag. You break my arms, you bleed out in the dirt. Look at me. For a long, agonizing second, the Emperor stared at her, the primal panic in his gold eyes met the stubborn, furious glare of a tiny, fragile human who smelled like fear and cheap soap. Slowly the tension left his jaw, his eyes rolled back into his head. Massive hand gripping her wrist went slack, thurring heavily against the floor. He had passed out from the pain. Rachel scrambled back, clutching her bruised arm to her chest, gasping for air. Her wrist was throbbing violently, a deep, sickening ache that made her want to vomit. She sat there for 10 seconds, shaking, letting the adrenaline metabolize. Just walk away, the dark voice in her head whispered. You did enough, you bought him time. She looked at the wound. The tube had relieved the pressure, but the bleeding hadn't stopped. The indigo pool was creeping outward, soaking into the naze of her uniform. The second, smaller heart was still pumping violently, pushing life out through a severed artery hidden beneath the shattered bone. Damn it, she whispered again. She crawled back. She shoved her injured arm against her stomach to keep it steady and used her good hand to dig into her medical kit. She pulled out a canister of human biofoam. It was a trauma sealant designed to expand inside a wound, clamp down on bleeding vessels, and harden into a rigid, breathable cast. It was designed for red blood for human internal temperatures. She had no idea what it would do inside. An alien. She needed to find the artery. She picked up a pair of heavy serrated forceps. She didn't have time to be delicate. She plunged her bare gloved fingers directly into the hot, slick mess of the Emperor's chest cavity. The sensation was revolting. Alien organs didn't feel like human ones. They were intensely hot, spongy, and textured with strange vibrating ridges. Her fingers slipped on the thick blood. She couldn't see anything. It was entirely tactile. She pushed past a pulsing membrane, her fingers blindly searching for the source of the heavy, rhythmic spurts of heat. There, a torn muscular tube writhing like a dying snake. She jammed the forceps down, blindly clamping the metal jaws over the slick artery. The forceps slipped. A jet of hot blood hit her neck. Rachel cursed viciously, a string of harsh, ugly words. She adjusted her grip, wiped the sweat stinging her eyes against her shoulder, and plunged her hand back in. She found the artery again. This time she locked her grip, clamping the forceps down with a sharp click. The heavy spurting stopped. Okay, she breathed, her voice trembling. Okay. Now the foam. She grabbed the canister, jammed the nozzle directly into the wound, and squeezed the trigger. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. The biofoam, calibrated for a human body temperature of 98.6 degrees, hit the Emperor's much hotter internal cavity and the strange chemical makeup of his blood. The foam expanded violently. It hissed, a harsh, angry sound, sending up a thin trail of acrid white smoke as it catalyzed. It felt like it was boiling. Rachel didn't flinch. She dropped the canister and slammed both her hands, even the bruised one, down over the wound, pressing her weight against the expanding foam to force it inward rather than letting it spill out over his chest. The heat burned through her gloves. The pain in her wrist screamed. Her shoulders ached, and her breath came In ragged, ugly gasps, she watched the Emperor's face, waiting for him to wake up and snap her neck. He didn't move. Slowly the hissing stopped, the foam hardened into a rigid gray mass, sealing the shattered bone, the severed artery, and the improvised chest tube into one solid, ugly block. Rachel sat back on her heels. Her hands were coated in a thick, drying mixture of indigo blood and gray foam. She stared at the Emperor's chest. It was rising and falling, slow, steady, uneven but functional. She had done it. The heavy metallic thud of mechanized boots suddenly echoed down the hallway. Rachel didn't reach for a weapon. She was too tired. She just slumped backward, sitting heavily on the blood-soaked floor, leaning against the Emperor's massive shoulder. A squad of sovereign shock troopers breached the room. They poured through the ruined doorway, heavy assault rifles raised, laser sights cutting through the settling dust. They expected to find a massacre. They expected to find their god Emperor dead. Instead, they found 30 dead guards, 6 mutilated assassins, and a tiny, exhausted human sitting in a pool of indigo blood. The lead trooper, a towering wall of armor, leveled his rifle directly at Rachel's head. Do not move, human. Rachel didn't raise her hands. She just slowly turned her head, looking up at the massive rifle barrel. She was covered in gore. Her hair was matted too, her forehead with sweat. She looked completely pathetic and yet completely unbothered. Do me a favor, Rachel said, her voice dry and hollow. Tell your boss I expect a clean uniform. The zip ties were entirely unnecessary, which somehow made them hurt more. They bit into the swelling flesh of Rachel's left wrist with every jolt of the armored transport. She snorts sat on a rigid metal bench, flanked by 4 sovereign shock troopers, who looked less like soldiers and more like walking tanks. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the low, stomach-turning hum of the transport's repulsor engines and the faint, wet crinkle of the Emperor's dried indigo blood flaking snorts off Rachel's uniform. She felt awful. The adrenaline had finally metabolized, leaving behind a hollow, trembling exhaustion. Her left forearm throbbed with a dull, rhythmic heat that synced perfectly with her heartbeat. She cradled it against her chest, her fingers numb. Her mouth tasted like old pennies and stomach acid. I should have stayed behind the pillar, she thought, closing her eyes against the harsh, strobe-like glare of the transport's interior lights. I could be drinking coffee right now. Terrible lukewarm coffee. I would kill for it. The transport slammed to a halt. The inertia threw Rachel forward, her bruised shoulder colliding sharply with the chest plate of the trooper across from her. He didn't flinch. He just shoved her back onto the bench with the casual, dismissive force one might use to move a piece of luggage. The heavy doors hissed open, revealing a stark, blindingly white corridor. They dragged her out by her good arm, her boots scuffed against the polished floor, her knees refusing to fully support her weight. They didn't take her to a debriefing room. They took her to a cell. It was a featureless cube of seamless brushed steel. There was no bed, no chair, no toilet, just a slope ledge extending from the far wall. The air was frigid, pumped full of an aggressively sterile chemical scent that burned the back of her throat like cheap bleach. The heavy door slid shut with a pneumatic thud that sealed the room in absolute suffocating silence. Rachel stood in the center of the room for a long moment, then her knees buckled. She hit the deck hard, gasping as the impact sent a fresh spike of agony up her fractured arm. She didn't try to get up. She just rolled onto her side, pulling her knees to her chest, shivering on the freezing metal grate. She drifted in a state of feverish half-sleep, haunted by the wet, bubbling sound of the Emperor's ruined chest. She didn't know how much time had passed when the door finally hissed open. Medic Rachel cracked her eyes open. Standing in the doorway wasn't a towering alien executioner, but a human. He wore the crisp, impeccably tailored uniform of a coalition diplomatic attaché. His name tag read Miller. He carried a sleek data pad and looked at Rachel with an expression of profound, unfiltered horror. Rachel slowly sat up, wincing as her stiff muscles protested. She leaned back against the steel wall. "Tell me you brought aspirin." Miller stepped into the cell. The door slid shut behind him. He didn't look at her face. His eyes were locked on her hands, which were still caked in dried gray Baphomet and alien blood. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Miller asked. His voice was a tight, controlled hiss. "I applied a field dressing to a tension pneumothorax and arrested a major arterial bleed." Rachel rasped. Her throat was painfully dry. "I also saved your boss's boss, so thank you would be neat. You touched the sovereign," Miller said, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his data pad. "You, a human auxiliary, placed your bare, unsterilized hands inside the chest cavity of a living god. You pumped him full of synthetic human industrial chemicals. The High Praetorian is calling it an act of supreme biological terrorism." Rachel let out a short, dry laugh that turned into a cough. Biological terrorism. He had a jagged piece of his own rib cage sitting in his lung. Snorts. His secondary heart was pumping out onto the floor. "If I hadn't plugged the hole with that industrial chemical, he'd be a corpse. A pure corpse." Miller snapped. "In sovereign culture, the flesh of the Emperor is sacred. It is an extension of their divine right to rule. It cannot be altered, and it certainly cannot be defiled by a lower species, by their laws. You didn't save his life. You polluted his soul." Rachel stared at him. The absurdity of it washed over her, heavy and exhausting. She looked down at her swollen purple wrist, then back up at the diplomat. "Right," she muttered, the cynicism coating her words like tar. "My mistake. Next time I see a dictator choking on his own fluids, I'll just offer thoughts and prayers. Are they going to execute me?" "They are debating it," Miller said, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "The Emperor is in the royal infirmary. He hasn't regained consciousness. Chains, their high medical priests, are trying to undo the damage you caused." But Miller hesitated, his eyes darting to the door. "They don't understand human medical tech. They don't know how to remove the foam." Rachel's blood ran cold. The fog of exhaustion vanished, replaced by a sudden sharp spike of professional panic. "Wait," Rachel said, pushing herself up the wall until she was standing, albeit swaying slightly. "They don't know how to remove it. It's catalyzed biofoam. It bonded to his bone and clamped the artery. If they try to laser it off or rip it out without a solvent, they are doing what their holy texts dictate." Miller interrupted. "They're going to tear the artery wide open," Rachel yelled, her voice echoing harshly. "In the small cell, it's a structural plug. If they pull it, he bleeds out in 30 seconds. Miller took a step back. Looking alarmed, keep your voice down. It is out of our hands. General Hayes has ordered all human personnel to stand down. We are distancing ourselves from your actions to avoid a diplomatic incident. A diplomatic incident. Rachel took a step toward him, her frustration boiling over. If their God dies because his priests are a bunch of glorified butchers, they aren't going to write a sternly worded letter. Miller, they're going to glass Chicago. Before Miller could respond, the heavy cell door ripped open. 2 shock troopers stood in the corridor. Between them stood an alien taller and broader than the guards. He wore robes of deep crimson over light combat armor. His golden eyes, the same terrifying eyes as the Emperor's, though less feral, locked onto Rachel. The human the alien commanded. His translated voice came through a vocalizer collar, sounding like grinding metal. Bring her. Miller scrambled out of the way. The trooper stepped in, grabbing Rachel by the shoulders. Hey, watch the arm, she snapped, kicking out. Instinctively, her boot connected with solid armor, doing nothing but bruising her toes. They hauled her out of the cell, dragging her down the pristine hallway. She didn't look back at Miller. She was too busy trying to remember the chemical compound of human trauma solvent. The Royal Infirmary did not look like a hospital, it looked like a cathedral. The ceilings were impossibly high, vaulted and painted with sweeping, luminous murals of alien conquests. There were no harsh fluorescent lights, only the soft ambient glow of floating holographic displays and braziers burning, something that smelled like sweet cloying incense. Rachel hated it instantly. It smelled like a funeral parlor. In the center of the vast room, elevated on a raised dais, lay the Emperor. He was stripped of his ruined armor, his massive, scale-covered torso exposed. Above him, 3 alien chirurgeons fluttered about. They wore ceremonial headdresses and operated intricate, hovering consoles that projected beams of soft golden light onto the Emperor's chest. It looked beautiful. It was entirely useless. The troopers dragged Rachel to the edge of the dais and dropped her to her knees. She groaned, cradling her left arm. The crimson-robed alien, the Taurian, stepped beside her. He pointed a long, scaled finger at the Emperor's chest. Explain this witchcraft. Rachel looked up. The golden light beams were scanning the massive chunk of hardened gray biofoam jutting snorts from the Emperor's ribs. The crude piece of plastic coolant tube she had jammed into him was still there, sticking out of the foam like a bent straw. It's not witchcraft, Rachel said, her voice shaking with a mix of pain and profound irritation. It's a chemical coagulant. It expanded to fill the void and clamped the bleeding. What are they doing to it? They are attempting to purify the wound, the Taurian rumbled. The sacred flesh rejects your synthetic filth. The Kyogens are applying harmonic resonance to shatter the obstruction. Harmonic resonance, Rachel repeated, staring at him. You mean they're trying to vibrate it apart? Yes. Rachel scrambled to her feet. The troopers stepped forward to strike her down, but she didn't care. Stop them. Tell them to stop right now. The Taurian's hand dropped to the hilt of a curved blade at his waist. You will not command. That foam is bonded to his artery. Rachel screamed, pointing at the operating table. If you vibrate it, you're going to shred the blood vessel. He'll hemorrhage internally and all. Your shiny golden lights won't do a damn thing to stop it, as if on cue the heart. Monitor hovering above the Emperor. Massive floating ring of bioluminescent. Fluid began to pulse erratically. A loud discordant chime echoed through. The cathedral, one of the Chiurans, stepped back, his four hands fluttering. In a panic, the edges of the gray foam were beginning to crack under the harmonic. Lasers and thick dark indigo blood was welling up from the fissurers. He's crashing, Rachel said. She didn't wait for permission. She shoved past the Taurian. One of the troopers grabbed her collar, but the Taurian barked a sharp command in his native tongue. The trooper let go. Rachel stumbled forward, practically falling against the edge of the operating table. Up close, the heat radiating from the Emperor was intense. The incense smelled sickly sweet, masking the sharp metallic tang of his blood. Rachel looked at the Chiurans. They were staring at the cracking foam, paralyzed by their own rigid doctrines. They were scholars of biology, but they had never been in a trench. They didn't know how to do plumbing. I need my bag, Rachel snapped, looking over her shoulder at the Taurian. My medical kit, the one you confiscated. I need it right now. The Taurian stared at her, his golden slit pupils narrowing. He gave a sharp nod to a guard by the door. 10 seconds later, the heavy canvas bag was dropped onto the floor beside Rachel. She fell to her knees, tearing at the buckles with her good hand and her teeth. She dug past the sterile wipes and bandages until her fingers closed around a pressurized canister marked with a bright yellow biohazard warning. Solvent catalyzed trauma foam. She grabbed it, grabbed a pair of heavy surgical shears and stood up. Move. She barked at the nearest Chiuran, elbowing the towering alien out of the way. She leaned over the Emperor's chest. Her fractured left arm screamed in protest as she rested it against the edge of the table to steady herself. She aimed the nozzle of the solvent canister at the base of the cracking biofilm, right where it met the Emperor's shattered bone lattice. She sprayed. The chemical hit the foam, and the reaction was violently unholy. A thick, noxious cloud of white vapor erupted from the wound, smelling strongly of pure acetone and burnt plastic. The Turgans recoiled, covering their faces and hissing in disgust. Rachel didn't blink. Her eyes watered, tears cutting tracks through the dried blood on her cheeks, but she kept the nozzle engaged. The rock-hard foam began to turn to sludge. I need light, Rachel yelled over the hissing chemical reaction. Real light, not this religious mood lighting nonsense. Shine a direct beam into the cavity. The Taurian barked in order. One of the Chiurans hesitantly adjusted console. A harsh, brilliant beam of white light snapped onto the Emperor's chest, illuminating the gory, bubbling mess of melting foam and alien tissue. Rachel dropped the canister and grabbed the shears. Okay, big guy, stay with me. She plunged her hands back into the hot alien chest cavity, the sludge coated. Her gloves slick and foul. She found the jagged shards of the cracked bone plate that had caused the tension pneumothorax in the first place. You, Rachel said, not looking up, pointing a bloody finger at a Kaijan. Bring your cutting laser here. Calibrate it for bone mass. The foam is dissolving, but these bone shards are going to puncture the lung again if we don't extract them. Cut where I point. The Chiuran looked to the Taurian. The Taurian nodded. For the next 20 minutes, it was a butcher's ballet. Rachel used the heavy shears and her own brute strength to pry the melting chunks of foam away from the delicate, writhing artery, working with agonizing slowness to ensure she didn't tear the vessel. Her left arm was completely numb now, dead weight she was using merely to hold the rib cage open. Every time she isolated a jagged shard of bone, the alien surgeon would step in with pinpoint accuracy, using the surgical laser to cleanly sever the fragment. Rachel would pull it out, dropping the bloody alien bone onto the pristine metal tray with a wet clatter. She was sweating profusely. Her vision kept swimming, the edges of the room turning dark and fuzzy. The pain in her wrist was making her nauseous. Rotary is clear, Rachel gasped, pulling out the last glob of dissolved foam. The bleed is fully clotted. You can seal the vessel now. The Chion stepped in. He didn't use thread. He used a localized thermal welder, seamlessly binding the alien tissue together with a flash of heat. It was elegant. It was perfect. Rachel took a step back from the table. The adrenaline was gone. The room was spinning. She looked at her hands. They were trembling violently, coated in a toxic mixture of chemical sludge and indigo blood. She tried to take a deep breath, but her lungs felt tight. Vitals are stable, one of the Churans announced, his voice translated through the room speakers. The secondary heart has normalized. The obstruction is cleared. Rachel let out a long, ragged exhale. She turned to look at the Taurian. There she slurred, her tongue feeling thick and heavy. No witchcraft, just plumbing. Her knees finally gave out. She collapsed backward, the vatted ceiling of the Royal Infirmary spinning wildly before everything went black. Rachel woke up to the smell of antiseptic and the dull, throbbing ache of a properly set bone. She opened her eyes slowly, squinting against the light. She wasn't in the holding cell, and she wasn't on the floor of the cathedral. She was lying on a firm, comfortable cot in a small, dimly lit medical bay. Her left arm was encased in a sleek, lightweight immobilization sleeve that hummed faintly, pumping localized painkillers into her skin. She felt clean. Someone had scrubbed the blood and chemical sludge off her face and hands, leaving her in fresh, Standard Issue Coalition hospital scrubs. She sat up, groaning as her core muscles protested. "You are awake." Rachel froze. She slowly turned her head, sitting in a massive reinforced chair across the small room was the Emperor. He was awake. He was no longer covered in blood, though a thick synthetic patch covered the entire left side of his chest where his armor had been breached. He looked smaller without the oxidized copper armor, wearing a simple dark tunic, but the sheer dense mass of him was still suffocating. He wasn't flanked by guards. The Praetorian stood silently by the door, his hands clasped behind his back. Looking at the floor, the room was deathly quiet. Rachel didn't stand up. She didn't salute. She just rubbed her eyes with her good hand, let out a long, tired sigh, and leaned back against the wall behind her cot. "I'm guessing you're not here to give me a medal," Rachel said. Her voice was scratchy, but the localized painkillers made her brave. Or maybe she was just too tired to care. The Emperor shifted. The chair creaked in protest, his solid gold slit pupil eyes locked onto hers, up close. The intelligence in them was terrifying. He didn't look like a wounded animal anymore. He looked like an apex predator evaluating a very confusing insect. He spoke. The sound was deep, a resonant chest vibrating rumble that shook the small room, a heavy collar around his thick neck translated the words a microcond, later outputting a smooth, deeply synthesized voice. "You are the primate," the Emperor said. It wasn't a question. "My name is Rachel," she replied, picking at a thread on her scrubs, "and we prefer human." "Primate sounds like you're charging admission to see me." The Praetorian by the door tensed, letting out a sharp warning hiss. The Emperor raised a single massive hand, silencing his guard. He leaned forward. "I remember you," the Emperor rumbled. "I remember the burning in my chest. I remember the faces of my dead guard, and I remember a fragile, terrified creature plunging a piece of garbage into my body. A piece of a plasma rifle coolant line." Rachel corrected mildly, "and it worked. It was an abomination." The Emperor's voice dropped, the translated words vibrating with barely contained fury. "My flesh is inviolate. The penalty for a lesser species shedding sovereign blood is 1,000 cycles of torment. The penalty for altering my form is the eradication of your entire genetic line." Rachel looked at him. She looked at the patch on his chest. She thought about Jenkins missing his head in the hallway. She thought about the alien guards dead on the floor. She thought about the agonizing pain in her wrist when he had nearly crushed it. She didn't feel intimidated. She felt angry, a cold, cynical, deeply human anger. "Then eradicate me," Rachel said flatly. The Emperor paused. The translation caller remained silent. "Go ahead." Rachel continued, her voice rising, the exhaustion stripping away her filters. "Call your shock troopers, glass my planet, but before you do, let's get a few things straight. You were drowning. You were lying in a puddle of your own inviolate blood, choking to death. Your elite guards couldn't stop it. Your sacred high priests couldn't fix it. The only reason you are sitting in that chair right now, breathing my oxygen, is because I got my hands dirty." Torian took a step forward, his hand snapping to his blade. "Insolent dirt." "Stop," the Emperor commanded. The word echoed like a gunshot. The Torian froze immediately, dropping to one knee. Bowing his head, the Emperor stared at Rachel for a long, tense minute. Neither of them moved. The hum of the immobilization sleeve on Rachel's was the only sound in the room. The Emperor looked down at his own massive hand, the one that had gripped her wrist. He slowly closed it into a fist, then opened it. "You possess no weapons," the Emperor said slowly. "You possess no honor guard. You are a lower caste, a healer." "Combat medic," Rachel corrected quietly. "When I seized you," the Emperor continued, his golden eyes narrowing, "when I broke your bone, you did not flee, you did not strike back. You looked at me." Rachel swallowed hard, remembering the sheer terror of that moment. "I told you to let go. You threatened me," the Emperor said. The translation caller couldn't convey tone perfectly, but there was a strain, subtle shift in the cadence. "You told me, you held my life in your bag, you demanded my obedience." Rachel winced. Bedside manner isn't my strong suit. It was not manners, it was dominance. The Emperor leaned back his chair. "In my culture, an assassin seeks to end life. A warrior seeks to defend it, but to hold a life, to trap it in a cage of synthetic foam and chemical fire, and demand its submission so that it might survive." The Emperor let out a low, rumbling sound. It took Rachel a moment to realize it was a chuckle. It sounded like boulders, grinding together. That is a cruelty my people have never conceived, he said softly. Rachel stared at him, utterly bewildered. Cruelty? I saved your life, you denied. Me a warrior's death, the Emperor countered. You dragged me back from the void, bound my broken form with garbage, and humiliated my Charons in my own halls. He paused, his golden eyes locking on to hers with intense, piercing clarity. Snorts, it was the most ruthless display of power I have ever witnessed. Rachel sat perfectly still. She realized, with a sudden sinking horror, that he wasn't angry, he was impressed. I don't care about power, Rachel said, her voice shaking slightly. For the first time since she woke up, I just fix what's broken. The Emperor stood up. He towered over the cot, a massive, imposing monument of alien muscle and authority. He looked down at Rachel. Then you are wasted on your people, Rachel of the humans, the Emperor declared. The Sovereign Coalition requires a new chief of medicine, one who understands that flesh is a machine of war, not a temple to be worshipped. He turned toward the door. The Taurian stood up quickly, opening it for his ruler. The Emperor paused in the doorway, looking back over his shoulder. Rest, little primate, when your bone has knitted. We have much plumbing to do. The official transfer document was printed on physical paper. That was the detail Rachel couldn't get past. In an era of encrypted data pads and instantaneous quantum transmission, the Human Coalition had authorized her permanent reassignment to a hostile alien empire on a piece of heavy cream gold card stock. It felt like a treaty. It felt like a bill of sale. Miller, the diplomatic attaché, stood at the foot of her cot. He wouldn't look her in the eye. He kept his gaze fixed on the humming immobilization sleeve on her left arm. The air in the small medical bay felt stagnant, heavy with the smell of sharp antiseptics and Miller's nervous, sour sweat. You have to understand the geopolitical reality, Rachel, Miller said. His voice was overly loud, projecting the fake confidence of a man trying to justify cowardice. The Emperor's survival is a miracle, but the fundamentalists in his court are demanding blood for the breach. General Hayes had to make a concession to prevent a localized war. A concession, Rachel repeated. Her voice was flat, devoid of the panic Miller clearly expected. She reached out with her good hand, took the cream-colored paper from his trembling fingers, and let it drop onto her lap. He traded me. He promoted you, Miller corrected hastily. You are now officially listed as a sovereign affiliated contractor. Your hazard pay is quintupled. Your pension, my pension, is useless if they decide to execute me tomorrow because I didn't bow correctly. Rachel cut in. She rubbed the bridge of her nose, feeling the grit of exhaustion still clinging to her eyelashes. You told them I was a rogue asset, didn't you, to save your own skins? You told them I acted alone, and now that the Emperor has decided he likes my ruthless dominance, Hayes is spinning it as a diplomatic gift. Miller finally looked at her. His face was pale. We are avoiding the slaughter of 4 billion human colonists in the outer rim. Snorts, you are doing a profound service for your species. Rachel laughed. It wasn't a heroic sound. It Snorts was a dry, rasping cough that scraped her throat. Get out, Miller. Rachel, the coalition will get out. She didn't yell. She just stared at him with cold, dead eyes. Miller swallowed hard, nodded stiffly, and backed out of the room. The pneumatic door hissed shut, sealing her in. Rachel sat in the silence for a long time. The faint hum of her immobilization sleeve was the only company she had. She wasn't a soldier. She didn't have a warrior stoicism. She was a kid from Chicago who had joined the Auxiliary Medical Corps to pay off nursing school debt, and now she was the personal mechanic for a warlord who routinely glassed planets. A heavy, rhythmic thud echoed in the corridor. The door slid open again. It was the Turian, up close without the immediate chaos of a dying monarch between them. His sheer size was suffocating. His crimson robes rustled like dry leaves, masking the faint clink of the heavy armor underneath. He didn't carry a data pad or a cream-colored piece of paper. He carried a bundle of dark, heavy fabric. He dropped it at the foot of her cot. It hit the mattress with a dense metallic clatter. The Sovereign has commanded your relocation, the Turian rumbled, his vocalizer spitting out the translation with grating mechanical neutrality. You will inhabit the chambers adjacent to the Royal Infirmary. These are your new garments, the insignia of the chief. Turin has been affixed. Rachel picked up the bundle. The fabric was coarse, woven from some kind of synthetic, fire-resistant polymer. It was entirely black save for a heavy oxidized copper badge pinned to the breast. The badge depicted two crossed blades over a shattered sun. The Sovereign crest. She ran her thumb over the cold metal. I don't suppose I get a say in the decor of my new room. The Turian slit pupils narrowed. You are granted life, human. Do not test the boundaries of the Sovereign's amusement. You will dress. You will follow. Your duties begin immediately. My arm is broken, she pointed out, lifting the humming sleeve. Then you will heal with the other, he replied coldly. A true healer does not require symmetry. Rachel sighed, swinging her legs over the edge of the cot. The floor was freezing against her bare feet. Fine, but tell your boss something for me. The Turian paused, his hand hovering near the door control. Speak if I'm the Chief Turin now, Rachel said, wincing as she pulled the heavy dark tunic over her head with one hand. I snorts expect my own coffee machine. And if anyone brings me a cup of whatever that sweet incense-smelling sludge is that you people drink, I'm using my one good hand to pour it down their breathing tubes. The Turian stared at her for a long, unblinking moment. Then, with a sharp, disgusted clicking of his mandibles, he turned his back. Get dressed, Primate. The assassins hadn't acted alone. That became violently apparent 48 hours into Rachel's tenure. She was in her assigned quarters, massive vaulted room that felt more like a mausoleum than a bedroom, when the acoustic dampeners vibrated hard enough to rattle her teeth. A concussive boom echoed through the stone. Then the klaxons started, not electronic sirens. They were massive physical brass war horns that roared like a dying Leviathan. Instinct overrode exhaustion. Rachel grabbed her scavenged human medical kit, threw it over her uninjured shoulder and ran. The Royal Infirmary was a slaughterhouse. The Splinter faction had launched a suicidal assault on the lower gates. The Sovereign shock troopers repelled them, but the cost rolled through the cathedral doors in a tide of gore. The pristine marble floor was painted in streaks of thick frothing indigo. The smell hit Rachel like a brick. Sickeningly sweet alien blood mixed with scorched polymer and vaporized meat. In the center of the madness, the Charogens were killing their own men. Not intentionally, they were just being. Priests. 3 of them hovered over a trooper, missing everything below the left knee. The stump pumped hot, dark blood onto the floor in rhythmic, catastrophic spurts. The Chions weren't stopping it. They were waving golden holographic consoles, chanting a low harmonic prayer to ease the soldier's spirit into the void. Rachel saw red. Move, she screamed, her boots slipping in the slick pools. The priests ignored her. One raised his 4 hands toward the vatted ceiling in religious ecstasy. Rachel didn't argue. She dropped her canvas bag, stepped in tight, and drove her good shoulder directly into the chanting alien's spine. The priest, off balance, stumbled forward with a startled hiss, crashing into the operating table, his holographic console shattered on the marble. Blasphemer. Another Chiron roared. Rachel ignored him. She dropped to her knees in the puddle of blood beside the dying trooper. She didn't have a human tourniquet large enough for an alien thigh. She grabbed the heavy synthetic strap, connecting the trooper's chest plate to his battle harness, and saw it off with her boot knife. Hold him down, Rachel barked at the wounded trooper squadmate, who stood frozen in shock. I said hold him down. Do you want him to die? The sheer growly authority in her voice snapped the massive soldier out of his daze. He dropped heavily onto his squadmate's chest, pinning the thrashing casualty. Rachel wrapped the strap high and tight around the ruined thigh. Lacking a windlass, she grabbed a discarded plasma pistol magazine from the floor, wedged it under the strap, and twisted it with all the strength her right arm possessed. The trooper unleashed a guttural roar, his golden eyes rolling back, but the heavy spurting stopped. Rachel tied the magazine off, gasping, her black tunic soaked in indigo. The infirmary went dead silent, save for the groans of the dying. Every priest and bleeding soldier stared at the tiny human kneeling in the gore. The shoved priest recovered his footing, pointing a scaly finger. You defy the sacred transition. The flesh is broken. It is the will. Shut your mouth, Rachel snarled. She stayed on her knees, hand firmly over the makeshift tourniquet. The only will in this room is mine. I'm the chief Chiron. The sovereign gave me that title. Are you defying the sovereign? The priest recoiled, mandibles clicking nervously. Rachel scanned the 30 wounded soldiers. The quiet ones were the most dangerous. Listen to me, she yelled, pointing at the nearest uninjured trooper. You sort them screaming on the left, quiet and pale on the right. That is priority. Triage. She turned her glare on the priests. Turn off your flashlights and get your thermal welders. We have severed arteries and kinetic shrapnel. We are plumbers today, gentlemen. We fix the pipes, we seal the leaks, and we do not let a single one of these bastards die. For a second, cultural inertia weighed down the room. Then the shock trooper who helped her pin the amputee let out a low grunt of approval. He grabbed a screaming soldier by the harness and dragged him left. The spell broke. The practical creatures of war immediately understood the logic. Rachel's snorts didn't stop moving for 7 hours. She worked with one hand, a fractured arm, and cynical adrenaline. She taught towering killing machines how to apply pressure dressings. She forced priests to use surgical lasers to cauterize instead of pray. When soldiers thrashed, she cursed at them in English until they were too confused to struggle. When the klaxons finally ceased, Rachel looked around. 32 casualties had come through the doors, 29 were alive. She slumped against the cold stone of an operating table, sliding down to the floor. Her boots rested in drying, sticky sludge. Her left arm throbbed with a sickening heat. She closed her eyes. She just needed 5 minutes. Heavy, dragging footsteps echoed on the marble. Rachel opened one eye. The Emperor stood over her. He was not wearing armor. He wore loose dark robes that hung heavily over his massive frame, concealing the bulky medical patch over his chest. He looked pale, the micro scales of his skin lacking their usual iridescent sheen. He was leaning slightly on a thick, oxidized metal staff. He didn't speak immediately. He simply surveyed the room. He looked at the neat rows of surviving soldiers resting on the makeshift cots. He looked at the discarded tourniquets, the blood-soaked rags, the shattered holographic consoles of the priests. He looked at the Charons who were standing in the corners of the room, looking utterly traumatized and coated in the blood of their caste. Finally, his solid gold-slit pupil eyes dropped to Rachel. She looked like a corpse. Her black tunic was stiff with dried gore. Her hair was matted to her skull. She didn't try to stand up. She just looked back at him, her chest heaving with slow, exhausted breaths. "They tell me you struck a high priest," the Emperor rumbled. His vocalizer collar was turned down, making the translation a low, intimate vibration. "The quiet room." "He was in my way," Rachel rasped. Her throat felt full of glass. "They tell me you bound my warriors with garbage. It's called a tourniquet, and they're your warriors. It would be a shame if they bled to death because your priests prefer to sing at them." The Emperor shifted his weight on his staff. A faint, shuddering breath escaped him, betraying the immense physical toll simply walking down here had taken on his healing lung. He slowly, agonizingly lowered himself down. He sat on the blood-stained marble floor, directly across from her, his massive knees pulled up, his robes pooling in the gore. Rachel blinked, genuinely startled. "You shouldn't be sitting on the floor. It's not sterile. Nothing in my empire is sterile anymore, Rachel of the humans," the Emperor said quietly. He looked at his soldiers, the uninjured shock troopers in the room, seeing their sovereign sit in the filth, immediately dropped to their knees in absolute terrifying unison. The Emperor ignored them. He was focused entirely on the tiny broken creature slumped against the table. "Why do your people do this?" he asked. There was no anger in his synthesized voice, only a profound alien curiosity. "Do what?" "Deny the natural order," he said, gesturing vaguely with one massive hand toward the surviving amputee across the room. "He is broken. In the wild he would be left to the scavengers. By the laws of the transition, his spirit was ready to be released. Yet you fight with such unnatural fury to keep the broken pieces bound to this reality." "Why?" Rachel let her head back against the stone, staring up at the vaulted ceiling. She thought about Jenkins. She thought about Miller handing her over. She thought about the cold, lonely reality of the human condition. "Because the natural order sucks," Rachel said simply. The Emperor tilted his head, his golden eyes narrowing, slightly, trying to process the translation. "You guys," Rachel continued, her voice quiet but steady, "you think you're gods. You think your blood is sacred, and when it spills, it's destiny. But humans, we know we're meat, we know. We're fragile, the universe has been trying to kill us since we figured out how to make fire. She lifted her good hand, wiping a streak of dried blood from her cheek. We don't have harmonic prayers, we don't have a sacred transition. We just have the dirt and the dark and each other, so when the dark comes for one of us, we don't bow our heads and let it happen. She looked directly into the Emperor's terrifying eyes. We spit in its face, we patch the pipes. We buy another day because another day is all we've got. The silence stretched between them, heavy and thick. The Emperor stared at her. He didn't blink. For thousands of years, his species had conquered the stars through sheer unyielding belief in their own divinity. They did not fear death because death was simply a failure of flesh beneath the dignity of the soul. But looking at Rachel, he saw something infinitely more terrifying than fearlessness. He saw the grim mechanical stubbornness of a species that viewed death not as a spiritual transition, but as a technical malfunction to be violently corrected. You view my empire as a machine, the Emperor observed. Softly, a biological one, Rachel agreed, and right now it's leaking. The Emperor let out that low rumbling sound. Again, the grinding of boulders. I laugh, my priests despise you, he said. The feeling is intensely mutual. My Taurians do not know whether to execute you or worship you. Tell them to keep their distance and bring me a clean shirt. The Emperor slowly pushed himself back to his feet, leaning heavily on his staff. He towered over her once more, the absolute ruler of a trillion souls, but the dynamic had shifted fundamentally and permanently. He was the god, but she was the mechanic, and even gods break down. You will remain chief, the Emperor decreed, snorts, his voice rising just enough for the kneeling troopers to hear. You will teach my warriors your plumbing. You will teach them to spit in the face of the dark. He turned to leave, but paused, looking back down at her and Rachel. Yes, she sighed, I will have my guards locate a coffee machine. Snorts, but if it tastes as foul as you describe, I will have you thrown into the sun. Rachel finally smiled. It was a small, ugly, exhausted smile, cracking the dried blood on her face. Deal, and that's the end of Rachel's brutal first week as the chief Chiron of the sovereign empire. She didn't ask to be the alien god's personal mechanic, but humans are nothing if not adaptable. If you love this gritty, raw take on human stubbornness and medical survival in deep space, please hit that like button right now. Share this story with your friends who appreciate real grounded sci-fi, and make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another HFY adventure. See you in the next one.